Good evening and welcome to Wayne State University. It is our pleasure to host tonight's debate on globalization and the American worker. Wayne State and the World Affairs Council of Detroit are proud to bring this event, a collaboration between the Brookings Institution, Charles Koch Institute, and POLITICO to Detroit. In a moment, I'll turn the stage over to Will Ruger, Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute, to speak more about the series. But first, I wanted to say it is a privilege to have all of you here tonight for this critical conversation. We are living in a rapidly changing world with very significant implications for this critical discussion. We see this every day here in Detroit, which is truly a global city. We see this in our geography, in our people, in the culture, and in its economy, which is critical to both the nation and the world. It is why there is no better place to have this debate than here tonight. So again, thank you all for coming, and to frame this discussion, I'd like to welcome to the stage Will Ruger.
Thank you very much, and really appreciate you hosting us here in Detroit. So I work at the Charles Koch Institute, and we've been funding this series in partnership with the Brookings Institution and POLITICO and a variety of local partners. And what we've really tried to achieve is to broaden the conversation that's happening in the country around foreign policy, and to bring it to the country that actually oftentimes has to bear the costs and can benefit from what's happening in Washington, and to come out to around the country to places like St. Louis, to places like Las Vegas, Seattle, Detroit, to Dallas-Fort Worth, and to come to places and to have a conversation about what should America's role in the world be? What should the United States be doing? How should we be engaging, or in many cases not engaging? What are America's national interests, and how do we make America safe? And so we thought that it would be great to bring a kind of conversation that sometimes is a little bit narrow, if you're watching TV on Fox News or MSNBC, to try to broaden that debate by having academics and scholars from a variety of different perspectives come and have a civil discourse, not yell at each other, but really try to dig into issues. And it doesn't mean they have to agree. It just means that we have to be civil, to focus on ideas, and really try to involve people and engage people in a conversation about what it means for America to be engaged and what makes us safer and more prosperous. And so tonight's discussion about trade, globalization, the American worker fits nicely into that, especially when it comes to prosperity, but not just prosperity, because economic prosperity helps contribute to America's security, because you have to be a wealthy state to be able to afford the kind of military power that the United States enjoys and that ultimately secures our country. And so I'm going to turn it over to our scholars now and to our colleague from POLITICO to have this debate, and we welcome your questions, as well as to welcome the people that are watching online. There are hundreds that have signed up already and that are joining us tonight, and we're looking forward to those questions that will come both here and through the online portal. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome again to the sixth debate on America's changing role in the world, convened by the Brookings Institution and the Charles Koch Institute in partnership with POLITICO. My name is Doug Palmer. I'm a senior trade reporter for POLITICO, and it's a real pleasure to be here in Detroit tonight for tonight's debate, co-hosted by Wayne State University and the World Affairs Council of Detroit. And I'd like to thank Delashawn and Will for opening up tonight's event. And thank you to our audience here in the room and those joining us online. I'm also delighted to be joined by Dustin Walsh, senior reporter at Kane's Detroit Business, who will moderate the question and answer portion of tonight's program. This debate continues a series visiting cities across America to foster a vigorous, civil, and constructive national discussion on the future of U.S. foreign policy. Tonight's debate will focus on globalization, trade, and the impact of these forces on America's workers. Over the last 25 years, expanding trade and increased innovation have deepened global economic ties. Today, however, we see considerable strains on that system. From recent developments, such as President Trump's newly announced tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and the European Union, to long-running shifts in labor markets and manufacturing, the future of our economy is rapidly changing. This evening's debate will explore these issues and more in 4 different segments. There will be a first round of debate moderated by me, a question and answer session comprised of questions from our in-person audience and followers on Twitter, which will be moderated by Dustin Walsh, a second round of debate moderated by me, and then brief closing statements. To keep the conversation moving, our debaters have been asked to limit their answers to 90 seconds, which I think may be the biggest challenge of the evening. Our audience in the room and online are encouraged to submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag America in the World, which you can see up there on the screen. But again, that's hashtag America in the World. Those in the room will also be able to submit questions in writing on note cards collected by debate organizers at about the 15-minute mark during our first segment of debate. With that, let me introduce our debaters, starting from left to right for those of you in the audience. Dan Eichelson is the director of the Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on international trade and investment policy. Since joining Cato in 2000, Eichelson has authored dozens of papers on various aspects of trade policy, including on U.S.-China trade relations, bilateral and multilateral trade agreements and institutions, U.S. manufacturing issues, and trade remedies. Next, we have Bill Galston, a senior fellow and the Ezra K. Zilka Chair in the Government Study Programs at Brookings. From 1993 to 1995, he served as Deputy Assistant to President Bill Clinton for Domestic Policy. Previously, Bill also held the roles of Saul Stern Professor and Acting Dean at the University of Maryland's School of Public Policy, and as Executive Director of the National Commission on Civic Renewal, which was co-chaired by William Bennett and Sam Nunn. Christine McDaniel is a Senior Research Fellow with the Program on the American Economy and Globalization at the Mercatus Center. She has held several positions in the U.S. government, including Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Treasury Department and Senior Trade Counsel in the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Her work on economic issues includes positions at the Commerce Department, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and the U.S. International Trade Commission, as well as in the private sector at Sidley Austin. And then last, we have Mark Muro, a Senior Fellow and Director of Policy with Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, where he leads the program's advanced and inclusive economy activities. Mark is an expert on regional technology systems, digitalization, and economic development. He has published extensively on advanced industries, manufacturing, innovation, automation, digital trends, energy, and regional development issues. So with those introductions, let's dive into the debate by looking at trade liberalization over the past several decades. And Dan, I'd like to start with you. Over the past 20 to 30 years, we've seen an expansion and deepening of trade relationships through trade agreements like NAFTA and the creation of the World Trade Organization. To ask the big question of the evening, are Americans better off after those agreements than they were nearly 30 years ago?
Thank you for the question, Doug, and thank you all for coming here. I know trade has been an important issue to people in Detroit and Michigan and in this area. I think incontrovertibly, trade has been good. Trade liberalization has been good for the United States economy. We have seen tariffs drop from 40 to 4% over the post-war period from 1947 when the first GATT convened, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and we had 23 original contracting parties, 8 subsequent rounds of multilateral liberalization after that, which deepened and broadened trade liberalization. And we then started pursuing bilateral and sort of regional trade agreements with Israel and Canada, and then we had the North American Free Trade Agreement. I think whenever you can reduce trade barriers to integrate markets, you are expanding the scope for economies of scale and for specialization. I think it is really an incontrovertible good to have that. That said, there's been a lot of focus on some of the downsides of trade. NAFTA, allegedly, somebody once said something about a giant sucking sound. I'm not so sure that that really came to fruition. There's been some investment that went to Mexico. Some jobs were migrated to Mexico. We shifted our job composition here. But as I'll get into a little bit later, because I'm about to run out of time, this has not been bad for the United States at all. It's been very good, and I have a lot of statistics to refer to soon.
Bill, when you worked in the Clinton administration, they initially had some hesitation around the impact of new trade agreements on American workers, but later became vigorous champions of NAFTA and the WTO. Looking back, do you think that maybe they should have paid more attention to those concerns? Do you think that the Clinton administration was wrong to push for approval of NAFTA and the deal that created the WTO?
Well, I will give different answers to the two halves of your question. The Clinton administration did not hesitate for very long before throwing its full weight behind the ratification of NAFTA, and which actually occurred in the fall of Bill Clinton's first year. And I would say that on the whole, the impact of NAFTA has been pretty good for the American economy, and the creation of this continental supply chain has made it possible to manufacture things in the United States that otherwise would have been completely transferred to other countries. And so I think a lot of the brickbats thrown in NAFTA's direction are misplaced and misguided. China is a different matter altogether. I think in retrospect that many of us were much too optimistic about the net benefits of incorporating China as it was into the global trading system. We assumed, I think not unreasonably at the time, but incorrectly as it turned out, that the Chinese economy would, through its integration into the world economy, converge towards the Western market model. We also assumed, by the way, or at least hoped, that the Chinese government would converge gradually towards the democratic and more liberal model. Both of those assumptions were misguided, and I think American workers have paid the price.
Christine, what do you think about that? Do you think that American workers have paid the price for China's entry into the global economy or the WTO, and for NAFTA as well? I mean, what do these agreements actually do that has an impact on the lives of everyday Americans?
Yeah, I agree with Bill that the royal we, largely underestimated the adjustment costs when China acceded to the WTO. That was 1.2 billion people coming sort of online to the global economy, right? And the manufacturing worldwide was already starting to undergo this sort of increased innovation, labor-saving technologies. So when you get 1.2 billion people to kind of show up and are willing to work for a fraction of what American workers, the going rate there, and they're hungry, and they still are, yeah, it was huge adjustment costs, and change is hard. That said, we can get into it later, but what would we have done differently? I think that will be interesting tonight. And one last thing, I just like to remind people, trade is a loaded term, but trade, we often forget, trade is done by individuals, right? Two people. If it's just a domestic sale, then it's within our borders. If one person is in the US and another person is outside of the US, then we call it trade, international trade. But these are just individuals that want to exchange money for a good or service from somebody else. So individuals trade, governments don't trade. And so all those decades of liberalization that Dan talked about were for breaking down those barriers so individuals could exchange more of their goods and services with others from around the world.
Right. Well, Mark, maybe we can pick up on that point a little bit about trade being sort of, it's a voluntary activity that takes place between peoples, both at the local level and internationally. But sometimes that trade has detrimental impacts on communities, I guess beneficial impacts as well. So how do you measure the impact of trade on communities? We know it causes dislocations that can harm some, even while it may benefit the overall economy. How do we judge trade?
Absolutely, and thanks all for having me, and this is certainly a great place to have this conversation. So, I mean, the way I think of it is that trade is incontrovertibly, to use Dan's word, a benefit, but it is a mixed benefit, an ambiguous benefit. We've often in this country have sort of over-idealized, over-complacent views of it, and to Bill's comment, China was something that was not anticipated, so much bigger, so much faster in its ramp up. But so the benefits, 10 to 15 million jobs, absolute minimum. Trade reliance in a place like Columbus, Indiana, 50% of all GDP is trade. These are, and in this region, several 100,000 jobs. So these are substantial benefits, and then with consumer benefits. But that is in the aggregate. The former consensus was the trade was Pareto improving, that is, the benefits outweighed the costs. That may be in aggregate, but if the benefits are diffuse, the harms or injuries can be very local and substantial. David Otter at MIT, suggested something like 2.4 million jobs in very specific places associated with China's entry. So, there are true local negative impacts that have to be taken into account, and that we had an overly, I think, complacent view of this going in.
Right. But Christine, let me come back to you, because President Trump repeatedly points to the trade deficit, not only with China, but with the entire world, as evidence that past trade policies aren't working for the United States. What do you think of that argument?
Okay, so everyone repeat after me. Trade policy has nothing to do with our trade balance. If you take home one thing tonight, please take home that, okay? Our trade deficit has nothing to do with our trade policy. America has a trade deficit because we consume a lot and we don't save very much. And there are a lot of other countries out there who consume less than we do and save a lot more than we do. And so we are a net borrower, right? And we like to consume, and we can't afford all of it, so we have to finance that. And so we have a current account deficit, a trade deficit, but we have a capital account surplus. All these dollars are flowing into the US, showing up in factories that Toyota and Nissan make here, treasury securities. China and Japan are two of the biggest holders of US treasuries. So that allows us to keep consuming how much we consume. So our trade policy has nothing to do with our trade deficit, and do not let anyone tell you otherwise.
I'm just curious, is there anybody among the debaters tonight who thinks that the trade deficit is a good measure of whether trade policy is working or not?
I think it's a very bad one. It's one that President Trump holds dear. He views exports as Team America's points and imports as the foreign team's points, and the trade account is the scoreboard, and we have a deficit. So that means that we're losing at trade. The trade deficit, as Christine was saying, it's not a function of trade policy. In fact, we've been running trade deficits every single year since 1975, which happens to be 4 years after Nixon took us off the gold standard. The rest of the world was looking for places to invest, safe havens, good, strong investments. The dollar became the prominent reserve currency of the world. A lot of investment opportunities in the United States. By focusing on the deficit, we're kind of fomenting a fiction here.
Mm-hmm.
The deficit just means that Americans are buying more goods and services from foreigners than foreigners are purchasing from Americans. But we're leaving out a whole other class of transactions, and that's assets. So what Americans purchase from foreigners in terms of goods, services, and assets equals exactly what foreigners purchase of U.S. goods, services, and assets. That means when we run a trade deficit, we're running a capital account surplus. There's all these resources coming into the United States, whether it's foreign direct investment in factories here, purchases of government debt, corporate debt, stock market investment. That all underpins economic activity in the United States. And you know, it's a luxury really to be able to run a deficit the way the United States does. And we do attract a lot of investment when companies go out of business because Americans are purchasing more of what they're producing from foreigners. We have new investment coming in, building state-of-the-art firms with best business practices from companies that have succeeded in their own home countries. So I think I think there's an argument that the trade deficit is actually good for the U.S. economy.
Right, okay. But Bill, whether or not we have a deficit, it's undeniable that some workers have felt a negative impact from globalization, and or maybe you disagree. But I mean, my understanding is based on some of your research, you've come to the conclusion that globalization, you know, helps the interests of people in developing countries and helps elite and advanced economies, but it doesn't always benefit the working and middle classes in developed economies.
Yeah, that's more than what I think. It's what the best global economists have been able to demonstrate. There's a fellow named Branko Milanovic who produced a famous chart, and there's a little bit of debate around the edges, but basically, if you're in a developing country, whether you're a poor person, a middle-class person, or a rich person, you've had a very nice run in the past 4 decades. If you are an educated professional in a highly developed country, you've done very well for yourself. If you've been a worker or a member of the middle class in advanced economies, you have borne the brunt of globalization. And that's especially true for the manufacturing sector. Let me just give you some basic statistics to dramatize the problem. Between 1990 and 2000, we held about steady with manufacturing jobs. In the years between China's accession to the WTO in 2001 and the onset of the Great Depression, we lost 3.3 million manufacturing jobs out of the 18 million that we had in the year 2000. And then in the Great Recession, we lost another 2 million. That's 5.3 million manufacturing jobs, almost about 30% of our base. Those are jobs that were the best jobs that those workers are ever going to have in their lives. And that's why they're resentful.
Dan?
If you don't mind, I agree with some of what you've said, Bill. But goods liberalization, tariff liberalization happened first. Just to explain why it is that manufacturing had to adjust the most. Because tariffs are easy to identify as barriers to trade that you want to liberalize. And we have barriers on manufactured goods. We've been trying to liberalize services too. I think it'd be a great thing. It would be great for the economy. And I think that the adjustment costs would be more evenly spread once we're able to get there. But manufacturing is doing pretty well. I mean, when you talk about manufacturing, you have to talk about that separate from manufacturing employment. They're two totally different things. So manufacturing employment peaked in 1979 at 19.4 million workers. And in the 14 years between that and the first year of NAFTA, we lost about 2.7 million manufacturing jobs in the U.S. And then in the 14 years after NAFTA went into effect, through 2007, we lost 2.9 million. So the trajectory's been pretty much the same. So I think, you know, and the first 5 years after NAFTA went into effect, we added 600,000 manufacturing jobs in the U.S. I wouldn't say that NAFTA created those jobs, but for people who say that NAFTA killed U.S. manufacturing jobs or that trade liberalization kills manufacturing, I don't think that's right. We shouldn't blame trade for labor market frictions. Trade has one role, and that's to grow the pie. Labor market frictions are the result of domestic policies that we can agree on to some extent or the other are impediments to adjustment.
Well, I think we finally have a disagreement, right? First of all, you know, I divided manufacturing job losses into my periodization. You divided it into yours. I think mine is more revealing because it reflects actual changes in public policy. So let me just put a contrary to fact on the table? Or a question, perhaps. If China had not been allowed to accede to the WTO on the terms that it got, essentially concessionary terms, do you think we would have lost 3.3 million manufacturing jobs in the 6 years after China acceded to the WTO?
I am not doubting that China had a big impact. Largest, most populous country in the world, liberalized dramatically to get itself into a position to do these things. But I still think, yes, that has had some effect on it, but we have to, we adjust. And how do you get another job? Well, maybe you look at the regulatory environment, the tax environment, the occupational licensing, land use regulations, things that make it hard for people to take new jobs. In the tax code, there are incentives for companies to train people to acquire new skills in their same occupation. So a welder can learn how to use a new welding machine, and the employer gets a write-off. But why not allow that welder to switch into another industry, to a more higher value-added industry? Why doesn't the tax code incent that? Not saying that it should, but I'm saying that there's a lot of examples to point to. We have a federalist system, 50 states, all these different these laboratories of policy experimentation. Some states do better than others in attracting investment and employing people. We have to look at the policies that they're using.
Mark, I'll get to you in a minute.
Can I just interject? So while I broadly agree with Bill, I think there are effects of U.S. competitiveness that actually have begun to see manufacturing productivity after a very strong first decade. So we're now entering a period where we're seeing a weakening of U.S. competitiveness measured by productivity in this space. So I think that's another factor aside from simply trade ones, and I think we're going to wind up talking about preparing the economy for the global context and its competition. And I would just add that part of the picture over 20 years is now a growing shakiness in manufacturing productivity.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
We've already touched on China a little bit, and just kind of picking up on the points that Dan and Bill were making. I mean, Christine, when we think about China, I mean, in the popular imagination, it's almost portrayed as like this job-devouring monster. I mean, it feeds. It needs to, it's like a trade monster that lives on consuming American jobs, and that the United States somehow helped create this monster by bringing China into the WTO and the global system. So, I mean, what is your perspective on China? Are they a huge unfair competitor? Is China's participation in the global economy good or bad for the United States?
I don't think it's either good or bad. I mean, China is part of the world economy. You have to think 1.2 billion people. If they weren't allowed to accede in 2001, then the longer we would have waited, the longer we would have been delaying that huge adjustment. It was bound to happen. Just to put this in perspective, in 1980, it took 10 man-hours to make 1 ton of steel in the US. Today, it takes 1.5 man-hours to make a ton of steel. That is innovation. That's labor-saving technology. I think China's accession, India's accession, these large developing economies coming into the world economy, that probably sped up some of that automation, for sure, but it was bound to happen. I do get concerned, though, when I hear, people blame foreigners. It's so easy to blame foreigners, but they're people too. I mean, I remember President Trump, one night he was on Letterman, and Letterman asked him about his tie. Where's that tie made from? And it was made, overseas. And he said, well, and Letterman kind of called him out on it. He said, well, they have to work too, And so I think, the sooner that we realize that we are just one part of a bigger place, the easier our adjustment pains will be.
Right. Well, Mark, I mean, but what about the impact on the local community of China's entry into into the global economy. I mean, is there something that the U.S. could have done that would have softened the blow for workers?
Okay, two things. So first, the first thing is we have incredibly detailed accounting of this impact. As I said, 2.4 million jobs likely associated with the post-WTO period alone in very specific mappable communities across America. So again, that diffuse benefits that are absolutely real, but also extremely excruciating local impacts. So that is the nature of this entire riddle. But I think, meanwhile, we're now qualitatively moving to a different period. That earlier period of manufacturing competition, distinguished by the abruptness and scale of the Chinese emergence, is now moving to a completely different field, where we're going to be competing on technology, artificial intelligence, cloud-based, and I think that is going to very much change the whole way we need to think about this entire competition. But again, it will share the massiveness and the scale of the first one. So I think we need to be, buckle our seatbelts here.
Right. Okay. Christine, did you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, we hear about the 2.4 million jobs lost, thanks very much to Otter, Dorn, and Hansen. But it is good that they did that number, because then it can help us put the Bureau of Labor Statistics data in perspective. Last month, the United States economy created over 5 million jobs, and it also shed about 5 million jobs. And if you look at the past 12 months, the U.S. economy has created net nearly 2 million jobs, about 1.9 million jobs. So, and that's just over the last 12 months. So we have to put these things in perspective. I love data, I love data, but we have to put it in perspective. And that 2.4 million, that since China joined the WTO, back in 2001, in the past 12 months, the U.S. has created 1.9 million jobs. Also, the social safety net point, I think that would have helped a lot of our adjustment, having a stronger social safety net. But from what I see, the U.S. public doesn't really have an appetite for a stronger social safety net. So healthcare is not that portable like other countries. Canada and Australia have been able to do it. We don't have other wage insurance programs. So, and with the political polarization in Washington, it doesn't seem to be in our future at the moment either.
Okay, Mark, we'll finish with you and then go to the audience portion.
A friendly nuance here, or the 2.4 million is national. What we're talking about and what is important to keep our eye on are excruciating, massive community-level impacts in a shorter list of places. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the inherent nature of these. The other thing I just wanted to touch on, these were foreseeable. They were foreseen in President Kennedy's administration when TAA was created. So which is interesting, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program anticipated local serious adjustment problems. And they argued about it, through several administrations. It became a much smaller, much less ambitious program. To me, that's less important than the recognition and anticipation. And I think that we lost track of the local while discussing the global here. And I think I think we've, in the last few years, begun to see, the costs of doing that, which is a fraying of the consensus around trade in the United States.
Great. We'll get back to that issue after the Q&A. I'd like to turn it over to Dustin now for audience submitted by our audience, or for questions submitted by our audience and on Twitter.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Good debate so far. Detroit is uniquely affected by what's going on, particularly out at the White House in Washington, D.C. right now. We're clearly trying to engage in trade wars, so to quote Axl Rose, what's so civil about war? Is there an advantage to taking on certain tariffs? And I want to start with Dan on this one. Obviously, the dairy issue has come up. The United States has pretty exorbitant tariffs on certain things, including tobacco and soft lumber and things like that. So is there an inherent advantage to tackling those one-off tariffs one by one in the nature that we're kind of engaging in?
You know, we are in the process of renegotiating the existing NAFTA. It's kind of on hiatus right now because of the bad blood, because of the steel and aluminum tariffs. But yeah, trade agreement is the perfect place to negotiate reductions in trade barriers. In the TPP, which President Trump withdrew the United States from on his third day in office, Canada made commitments to reduce trade barriers in their dairy market and to address their supply management system. We agreed to cut our 25% truck tariff, which you guys might be familiar with, over the course of 25 years, like 1 percentage point per year. So, yes, we should get rid of all tariffs. They make no sense. They're taxes on consumers and on households and on businesses. Half of the value of U.S. imports are intermediate goods and capital equipment, which are the purchases of U.S. producers, and that raises their cost of production. So when we impose tariffs and the foreign government retaliates against us, we see revenues, our export revenues, go down. So the manufacturing sector sees its prices, its costs go up, its revenues go down, its profits get squeezed, and those are the profits that are supposed to fund the investment and the job creation, especially among Trump's support base.
All right, Bill, I want to go to you next. We were this close to signing a new NAFTA. Then a sunset clause was introduced and Canada walked away from the table on that. What if we don't? So we live in a world where people think that NAFTA was bad for jobs, or at least particularly in this region. So what if we don't re-sign NAFTA? Will that suddenly make jobs come back to the United States, and particularly manufacturing sector here in the Midwest?
I doubt it. As a matter of fact, I would make the argument, let's be very topical and very local. I would make the argument that there is today more production of automobiles in the United States than there would be if NAFTA had never gone into effect. Because the supply chain that has been developed, including Canada and Mexico as well as the United States, enables the United States to produce cars, making use of a combination of imported car parts and domestically produced car parts in a way that is competitive in the world economy. And without NAFTA, I think a lot of production of automobiles would have shifted much more quickly to Asia. I think the Chinese and the Japanese would be, the Japanese are plenty competitive as it now stands, but a lot of the Japanese companies have put production facilities in the United States that might have been located otherwise, and those are jobs for American workers. So I think that targeting NAFTA is really beating the wrong horse with the wrong stick.
Hear, hear.
So I'm doing this very linear. I'm moving to Christine next. So what is the impact on the U.S. economy when it comes to, particularly the U.S. worker, when it comes to the White House's preference toward bilateral agreements? So we've sort of abandoned this multilateral agreement style outside of NAFTA and tried to, if we look at South Korea, renegotiated that recently, looking at kind of what that means.
Well, I don't think we have abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership yet. There are still comments coming out of the White House that the president is willing to consider getting back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership once he gets a few wins under his belt. So,
if anything can fit there.
And I have learned, still learning, but to judge this White House by what they do and not what they say, because what they say changes so often, and often from minute to minute. So that said, you know, bilateral deals were a tactic that USTR Zellick pursued quite successfully, I would argue. I don't know if we could do that today. First of all, you need willing participants on the other side. And with this administration, it's not clear there would be that many. And second of all, you know, the U.S., again, we're just not as large of a share of the U.S. economy that we used to be. But more importantly, the real issues today facing the U.S. in terms of international trade and investment are so big, we need to team up with like-minded allies, or other countries that are frankly just as frustrated with China and other issues as we are. We can get to that next. And I think that's a more effective approach.
Mark, I want to go to you next, obviously. So a lot of your focus has been on productivity and the impact of free trade on communities. So we look at what's happening. Automation is another kind of four-letter word here in Metro Detroit for the worker. So if the low-wage countries can't invest in automation or have it invested as highly as the United States has, does that give us a competitive advantage? And how does that impact the worker?
First, productivity, as Paul Krugman said, is not everything, but it's almost everything. So even if no humans worked in the industry, because we were so automated, it would be valuable to have that industry. So, you know, that's a theoretical point. But, so there's absolutely a place in the United States for this super productive, highly automated form of manufacturing. I would say it's really the only way forward for the United States in manufacturing. So manufacturing is a high-tech industry that does not employ that many people. So that's the way it should be viewed, as a productivity driver. And I really think that that is our only way forward in manufacturing.
And go ahead. Please, Dan.
If I might just add on to that. Productivity gains are the objective of economics. It's the wellspring of wealth creation. So we want, to use Christine's example, to produce a ton of steel with fewer inputs, with fewer workers. But that has implications for the workers. If you needed 10 guys on the line to make a ton of steel last year and you have a new technology in place and you only need 5 guys, the economy needs to be able to find work, create jobs for those other 5. And that's when productivity gains really make a difference. So those other 5 people need to be employed elsewhere. So I just want to get back to trade gets so much of the blame. Politicians like to blame trade because they can blame somebody else. There are a lot of policies in place here that they've created that they should undo. And by the way, technology accounts for about 85% of job loss, according to a Ball State study from a couple years ago, and a new one just came out recently by St. Louis Fed. Mm-hmm. So we focus too much on trade, the impact of trade on jobs, because that's what politicians want us to do. It really has a much less significant impact than other things.
And one might argue that technology enabled global trade of the way we know it anyway.
Agreed.
But there's if I may.
You may.
There's a fly in the productivity soup. And at least up to now, productivity gains have tended net to displace people from higher wage jobs into lower wage service jobs. There's a reason for that, and namely that productivity is much lower in the service sector. But a lot of the service sector is made up of face-to-face human contact. Think of nursing homes, for example. And a number of economists have argued that the switch from manufacturing of goods to the delivery of services is inherently a drag on productivity and wages. So we have a big problem, and productivity is part of the solution, but also part of the problem.
We're kind of diverting a little bit away from trade here, and I want to keep it going that way, mainly because I want to start a fight between Bill and Dan. With the idea of automation becoming more and more, and moving people into lower productivity jobs. What do we say about domestic policy when it comes to wage subsidies? You want to start, Dan? You want to go to Bill?
Well, I don't think we should be subsidizing wages. We should be working on policies that create opportunity, that free up investment to hire more people. I think there's a lag in the debate to some extent, because right now we're at full employment. I hear stories from auto industry folks and other industries that they can't find people to do with the skills necessary to do the jobs. That doesn't speak to the need for a wage subsidy. That speaks to the need for apprenticeships or people trying to avail themselves of opportunities to improve their skill set and make themselves accessible to these kinds of jobs.
Well, you say you wanted to start a fight?
Let's do it.
I do favor wage subsidies. We're already doing them, and I think we should do more of them, and we should do them in the way that's most conducive to job creation. The Earned Income Tax Credit has been supported on a bipartisan basis since its creation more than 4 decades ago. I think we should significantly expand it and make it available to single workers and not just married people. It should be available to men and women on an equal basis. There shouldn't be a marriage penalty if 2 people receiving the EITC happen to get together. The working class in this country has gone through decades of wage stagnation. And decade after decade, the argument is investment, training will solve the problem. Well, maybe in the best of all possible worlds it would, but in the world that we live in, it doesn't. And we have to do something else, because otherwise we're going to have a revolution on our hands, and I don't want to be on the receiving end of it.
Are we already on the receiving end of it?
Yes, and I don't like it.
Do you know what else is a wage subsidy?
Sure.
Imports from China. It reduces the prices. All right, so real wages, maybe they're stagnating in nominal terms, but when Chinese imports are available to families at Walmart and other places, that helps extend their family budgets.
I want to go to Mark, since he's...
Can I add one asterisk to the wage insurance
You may.
or wage subsidy question? And that, again, grows out of the nature of places left behind, where there is evidence that once they are left behind, there is not natural convergence. There's actual, divergence, and a kind of lock-in occurs. So I would say that the wage subsidy should be spatially targeted. That's an interesting idea that's been put forward by several, quite neoclassical economists. We have a substantial problem in place around, and these subsidies might do better there. In other places, I think dealing with the adjustment problems through a much more aggressive retraining approach may be the best way.
Sure, and with that, I'm going to take us away from Detroit for a minute, so excuse me. I'm from Battle Creek. So we talk about this new job creation. It was 30+ an hour jobs at Kellogg factories. Those have been replaced by foreign auto companies, foreign auto suppliers, specifically Denso, and those jobs are now $11 an hour jobs. So I want to punt this to Christine a little bit. You mentioned 1.8 million jobs that were created, and this comes from an audience question stemming my thoughts. Christine mentioned 1.8 million jobs that were created in the last 12 months. What kind of jobs were those? Were those better jobs than the jobs that were destroyed?
There was a mix of jobs. There's no guarantee that, you are going to get the job that your parents got. There's no guarantee of that. There's no, you're not really entitled to, a great lifestyle. America has always been the land of, opportunity. We've always been more open to trade than other countries. And the public doesn't really seem to have an appetite for a social safety net. So you put all those things together, and you get some really hard adjustment costs, and as Mark has mentioned, is really they've been quite pronounced in certain local communities across America. But you know, that said, you look at the jobs that are getting created. There, I went back and looked at the occupational level codes the other day, and just looked at the you know, the jobs that are getting created today. There are occupational titles in BLS data today that didn't even exist 25 years ago. It's amazing. And there are a lot of job titles that don't exist anymore. So it's you know, the jobs that are getting created, that will get created tomorrow, we may not even know what they are yet. But there's no promise of anything. And so I think it's dangerous to get caught up in this, you know, but those jobs that are available today are not, you know, what our parents had. Well, no, they're not. But that was never part of the deal.
Mark, can we make the argument that the people that lost their job at Kellogg's and now work at Denso, that in fact those jobs were lost because of productivity gains and automation, and Denso in fact saved those jobs, saved workers by giving them a job they would have otherwise had?
What I think has happened actually through all of these changes, through the kind of hybrid of technology and trade, has been a sorting of the kind of jobs that are produced. So it's not just, and it is a polarizing effect, to use Bill's word, I think. The sense, the Denso jobs are now a bunch of computer software engineers and then other people to mine the technology. It's a much different wage profile. In some areas, it's the famous U shape or barbell. In some of the auto supply chain, it really is a high-tech organization now. So I think trade has been an incredibly important zone in which we have first seen these effects surfacing. And I think public policy is going to have to respond to a completely different shape of the occupational curve.
All right, so let's continue on public policy. I'm going to leave this open to anyone that wants to answer. Let's talk education. Has education responded to the globalization issue and how American workers adjust to that issue? Have we done a proper job, and if not, why? And if so, why?
I think we've done a terrible job. And our educational system has done a terrible disservice to millions and millions and millions of young people. And let me be specific. When I was a boy, a shockingly long time ago, I have to say, there was such a thing as vocational education. Not just in community colleges, but actually starting in middle school and certainly in high school. It was phased out as I got to be a young man for very good reason, that it really wasn't training people to do anything that would be very useful in the economy. But now we have an opportunity in our high schools to begin 21st century skills training. We don't have to tell every young person that if you don't get a 4-year BA that you're toast in the economy. It's not true. A lot of these employers who are looking for skilled workers that they can't find would be able to find them if we redirected some of the vast sums that we're spending on middle school and high school education, leading people in no good direction. If we gave them a skills training option, a lot of them would take it, and a lot of them would be better off if they did.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we're already starting to see that. Where I live, I see our high schools starting to offer a variety of vocational training programs, and communities are responding. I think school boards are responding. And I was reading in Silicon Valley, the parent-teacher associations out there, they're demanding that coding, computer coding is in the curriculum in middle school and in high school. And so I think that it's really exciting to see people speak up and these discussions being had across America and to see school boards respond.
And it's not too soon. It is actually extraordinary how weakly the nation responded to the China period, right? Which was a manufacturing-oriented skills challenge. Maybe manufacturing jobs weren't viewed as important by elites. Now, it is very clear that the China period is going to be a fundamentally digital challenge. Christine is noting some of the, and Bill are noting some of the exciting new solutions, everything from boot camps to universal exposure to, you don't have to become, you don't have to be a coder, but you need to be exposed to digital skills. You know, maybe we're going to learn something from the WTO period for the next period.
And Dan, I want to end here with you. I think we have time for one more question. We've done a good job here highlighting how not black and white this issue is. It is incredibly gray. But universally, everyone has agreed that trade is good for the overall economy. How do we get that message across to the individual that has been negatively impacted by trade? Because those people are out here, especially in Metro Detroit, they're out there. And whether it's right or wrong, they have that opinion and their heels are dug in. And all the talking heads, all of the statistics seem to not matter. Yes. So how do you get that message across? What are we doing wrong? What are we doing right? And how does that message translate to the common person that has been negatively impacted?
Yeah, that's a great question. But let me just start by saying we're talking about 15% of the people who've lost a job are losing it because of trade, as opposed to technology improvements. And should we emphasize how particularly pernicious it is when you lose your job because of trade as opposed to something else? I don't think that
that 15% put the president in the White House, though.
Yeah, plus others.
Sure.
So I don't know that we go to these people and console them. People lose their jobs, and it's a very uprooting and difficult process to deal with. But the message needs to be better. Think about this. President Obama and President Trump said the same sort of thing about trade liberalization, about a t-shirt. Who cares if you pay $5 less for your t-shirt if your neighbor's out of a job? That's how politicians talk about trade. It's just what is seen at that level. But that $5 savings to a mother raising 2 kids, multiplied by all the clothing she's buying, constitutes resources that she can spend elsewhere in the economy or save, and it's lent out for investment to entrepreneurs. So the benefits from liberalizing trade that maybe puts pressure on a garment factory that goes out of business results in jobs created maybe in other parts of the country. It's deferred 6 months, a year, and sometimes the benefits accrue somewhere else. It's a very hard message to make. I remember Obama and Romney running for president and pointing the finger at each other about who was the bigger outsourcer, when they could have tried to explain the benefits of it, but it's too complicated to explain. So I saw a tweet which sums it up best, which was that in trade policy, we need fewer Adam Smiths and more Don Drapers.
All right. That was my tweet. I don't know. No, it wasn't. Thank you. That's all the time we have from the questions from Twitter and the audience and myself. Thank you. Turning back to Doug.
All right. Well, thanks, Dustin. I feel rested after that break. I'm sorry that you guys didn't get a break because those are some pretty tough questions from Dustin. I guess for the last portion, I would like to turn to a series of questions more or less about current events in trade policy, and then conclude by looking at the future of trade policy. And Dan, I guess I would like to start with you on an issue that could sort of come to a head this week. President Trump has threatened to impose a 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods because he's upset over Chinese policies and practices that lead to the theft of U.S. intellectual property, that force companies to transfer their technology in order to do business there. And so he says, you know, we're going to level the playing field. We're going to impose tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. Is that a good idea?
It's not a good idea to impose the tariffs, but I share Trump's concern. These are legitimate issues. They've been around for a long time. U.S. companies operating in China have articulated more frequently, more recently, that they're forced to give up their technology, they're forced to do all sorts of things. There's intellectual property theft, there's been a sort of change of outlook among US multinational corporations operating in China. What happened with the US-China relationship that gets us to this point is, China graduated from a subsistence economy to a manufacturing powerhouse in the course of 30 years. We've discussed some of the consequences of that. It was in the Great Recession when China surpassed us as the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, and it set its sights on technology, and they had all these indigenous innovation policies they were promoting. There was intellectual property theft, and quite frankly, they were kind of brash about borrowing Western technology. Now they have this Made in China 2025 program. We should be doing something about it, but what we should be doing is standing shoulder to shoulder with the Japanese and the Koreans and the Europeans who also have these problems, bringing a case to the World Trade Organization. Maybe not all of China's behavior can be disciplined that way, but a lot of it could be. China actually has a very good record of complying with WTO decisions. But instead, we hit our trade partners, our allies, with steel and aluminum tariffs. We pull ourselves out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we've isolated ourselves. And now we're on the verge of using Section 301, which will violate our own WTO commitments, and we are the international scofflaw and undermining the rules-based system of trade.
Well, continuing in the same theme, Christine, I mean, we're here in Detroit. It's my first visit. I'm thrilled to be here. I love Bob Seger. I love the Supremes and the Temptations.
Eminem.
Yeah, Eminem.
Harder to love.
Well, more my children's generation than mine, Eminem was. But the Trump administration is talking about starting an investigation that could lead to a 25% tariff on auto imports. So we're talking about smacking a 25% duty on imported Toyotas, BMWs, Hyundais. Will that help folks here in Detroit if we do that?
No, that is not going to help. And by the way, I forgot to say thank you. Thank you so much, Detroit, for hosting this event. I love it here. I took a walk in the beginning, and when I got here today, it was awesome. So to follow up, though, on what Dustin was saying, real quick, here's the choice that Americans have to face, right? Individual economic freedom versus a government-controlled economy. So do we want the government to set our prices, tell us who we can buy things from, who we cannot buy things from, and at what prices? Because that is the road we're going down right now with all of these tariffs, right? A tariff is a tax. It's a punitive tax on consumers and manufacturers. And it's not going to change China's behavior. The way to change China's behavior is to work with our like-minded allies that are just as frustrated with China as we are. Like Dan was saying, we have Europe, we have our Asia-Pacific partners. Let's sit down with them and pen in stronger rules. So far, the WTO it's not up to the task yet. However, they have recently called for, they've opened their door and said, work with us. We know our rules aren't strong enough to deal with these tough issues like state-owned enterprises, investment restrictions, issues that have come up with these large countries like China that don't have a market economy, so they don't have the price signals, and so you get huge amounts of resources going into an industry, you get excess capacity. Now, you can argue whether this is a real problem, but it's definitely causing disruption in the United States and abroad. And to deal with that, we need to pen in stronger rules and stop shooting ourselves in the foot with taxes that are tariffs.
Bill, do you have thoughts on this you'd like to share?
Sure, I'm sharing guy. Everybody knows that. Well, first of all, I think we're now, just in the past few minutes, getting down to the nub of the issue. Focusing on China, what are the real legitimate complaints and what can we do about them? Let me list them. Number one, overcapacity in steel, aluminum, and other industries that would be resolved if it were not for aggressive government subsidies to keep those factories open. And when they're asked, why are you doing it? The answer is to ensure social stability. The answer to that is we have a social stability problem too. Don't export your social stability problems to us. That's point number one. Point number two, Chinese businesses supported by the government are systematically making what I can only call a Don Corleone offer to businesses, American businesses who want to do business in China. And that is, if you don't give us access to your crown jewels, your technology, we're not going to let you do business here. I don't know whether the WTO can take care of that, but if it can't, then we have to find some rule that can. And number three, the Chinese are not just expecting to dominate the commanding heights in the future. They have a program called China 2025, which is designed through massive government subsidies to ensure that they control the key technologies for the future. I don't know what the WTO can do about that, but we've got to do something or we're going to lose our future.
Right. Well, Mark, yeah, I guess what I'm curious about, I mean, people don't seem to think that tariffs is the right approach, but they do think that Donald Trump is onto something, that he's identified a problem. So, you know, what should be done?
Yeah, there's an iota of truth here, and I think my colleagues here have identified it well. You know, it's state subsidies, IP theft, restriction of foreign companies in general, mercantilism, overcapacity. Dan knows the longer list. I would add, though, in terms of remedies, is strengthening our own crucial crown jewel industries. We I think, have, you know, we're outwardly focused. We don't have to become a state-managed economy to avoid unilateral concession, which I think we have really allowed a deterioration of first our manufacturing capacity. But now I think we have I think we're going to need to protect with investments, R&D, and STEM worker training, and the construction and support of regional ecosystems to produce the kinds of competitive industries. We are seeing weakening in most areas. IT itself, we do seem to dominate. You know, a huge number of the top 50, you know, software companies are American, obviously. So that's a position of strength, and a period of competition in services, on digital services, could be a favorable period, but we can't unilaterally drift here, and I think we really are going to have to think, you know, I'll use the word industrial policy, not meaning picking in companies, but investing in the basics that support growth of particular industry types. We are not going to be able to go willy-nilly through the next 20 years.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Christine? I mean, is there a smart set of policies that could be put in place that would help bring back manufacturing or help manufacturing grow faster than it's otherwise projected?
Well, history shows governments are not good at picking winners and losers. Okay. So I don't know what we mean by that, industrial policy. Remember Japan. So much of what we hear today about our fears about China, so similar to what we heard in the 80s about Japan. Remember, we were so afraid of Japan buying up assets here in the US, you know, Japan's industrial policy, Japan's, you know, pouring money into particular industries. How did that work out for them? Not so well. They lost their shirts on most of those investments, and all those key industries didn't do so well. And so what makes us think that China's industrial policy is going to be any more successful? And why would we ever want to go down that road? We have it in the past, and I don't think we should in the future.
So you think the China's threat is overstated?
I think it is overstated, and I would really like to see our administration become more proactive instead of reactive. Every time China adds another line item onto their 2025 vision, you know, we see a new trade action on the horizon, and that is reactionary, and I don't think that is going to serve us well.
Mark, did you have a point?
I would just say that I think we need to err on the side of readiness and strengthening. And by industrial policy, I mean investments in the basics, the inputs for groups of industries, groups of firms. But, you know, R&D investment in the United States, both basic, you know, especially basic, is predicted to drift downwards through the next decade. Not a great policy decision. STEM worker production, we're not producing that many PhDs given the scale of our economy in most STEM areas. Those are the fundamentals. So we have got to step up our game, along with checking and countering the game playing going on in China.
Okay, Dan?
Yeah, I think we are overstating the China problem for two broad reasons. One, most of our trade relationship is good. It's collaborative. Americans benefit from it. American companies benefit from it. We need to distill that, separate that from the problems. And I think industrial policies that rely on subsidization and intellectual property theft need to be stopped. But the second point about the overstating the China threat, ZTE, you guys have been following the ZTE, the technology company that was sanctioned for violating U.S. export control laws to export to Iran and North Korea. They were cut off from all U.S. suppliers, and basically that was the end. That's the end for them because they are so dependent on U.S. technology. All of Chinese ICT, information communications technology companies, are heavily dependent on Western semiconductors, particularly U.S. semiconductors. They're not self-sufficient. So Trump is negotiating whether or not to give a reprieve to ZTE. And one of the reasons he wants to give a reprieve to ZTE because it turns out that all the U.S. telecom companies rely on ZTE's components for their telecommunications build-outs. So there's an interdependence here. And if we just point the finger at them and say that they're an enemy and that we can't trade with them, we're going to suffer. And so we tend to get hysterical. And I think that we've gotten that way. This predates Trump, this kind of concern about China. It's been going on for several years. But Trump has put an exclamation point on it.
Right. Well, Bill, I mean, in some sense, is the U.S.-China relationship too big to fail? I mean, is there are we too integrated in each other's economies that we really can't afford to go at each other tooth and nail?
Well, that was the theory that dominated elite European thinking in the years between 1904 and 1914, that these two economies were so interdependent that the ensemble of relationships was too big to fail. And what troubles me is that Germany and other countries in Europe had a different view of the matter, and China is converting some of its new economic power into rising military strength, which it is using to challenge our position. So is this relationship too big to fail? I'm afraid it may be too big to succeed in the long run, and I'm not the only one who thinks that. But since we're not too far from the end of the end of this discussion, I would be remiss in my duty to myself if I didn't say the following. Christine, it is absolutely true that life in America is no guarantee of anything. But there is something called the American dream. And the idea of the American dream is that if you work hard and play by the rules, that you're going to live a little bit better than your parents did, and you have a reasonable expectation that your kids are going to live better than you did. Those expectations have been challenged and derailed massively. And part of what we're going through now as a country, politically and socially, reflects this loss of faith in the American dream, which I believe it is vital to restore.
Do you want to respond, Christine?
Well, I will talk on the ZTE issue. That is a very serious issue, violating U.S. sanctions, economic sanctions, and that when a foreign company does that, that's not a trivial issue. So, but this case has been going on for a long time. So that's why it's important that we keep national security issues clearly separate from trade protectionism issues, right? So when the administration is using Section 232 National Security Clause as a really a tool for blatant protectionism, that is very concerning, because that undermines our ability to guard our national security where it really does need to be guarded. Violating economic sanctions is a very serious issue, and the U.S. Laws are set up. There were things going on with that to address those issues, and so I think it's important to keep in mind that there are national security issues that are real and that are out there that need to be dealt with, and that are being dealt with, but the trade issues where but we don't want to abuse our national security provisions in the trade area where it's unfounded.
Well, we are getting towards the end of the debate, and I just did want to touch briefly on what people think the future of trade might hold. Dan, I mean, under the Obama administration, we had the TPP with the 11 countries in Asia, and they were hoping to conclude a similar trade agreement with Europe. Both of those seem to be dead under the Trump administration, although who knows, they might come back in some form or another. What do you think folks here in Detroit should expect to see from the Trump administration on trade over the next 2.5 years?
A lot of uncertainty. This is a very unorthodox president. He's departing from about 80 years of trade policy history, going back to Franklin Roosevelt. The presidents from Franklin Roosevelt till Obama saw trade as a win-win, and that it was a good way to foster good relations among nations, good way to grow the economy. Trump, and they supported the institutions, the rule of law in trade, and it certainly didn't work to undermine it. President Trump sees trade as a zero-sum game, and he sees the United States as on the losing end of that, and he's very angry. There's a certain grievance. The grievance, I think, comes from this notion that the United States is this benevolent giant that helped rebuild the world after the Second World War. And what did the Europeans and the Japanese and Koreans do? They went ahead and built their own industries and competed with us. And wow, and they took some subsidies. And the United States is more equal than others. And I think that really does motivate Lighthizer and Trump, where they think the WTO should have special treatment. There's American exceptionalism to attend to in the trading system. And so, the president is right that the U.S. has some leverage because we have a trade deficit with many countries and overall. So he thinks others are more dependent on us, so we can wage a trade war. And we're less dependent on trade than the global average, 27% imports and exports over GDP in the U.S. It's 53% globally. So we might be able to outlast someone, but there will be a lot of collateral damage. And the fact that he's willing to risk that scares me really deeply. He's trying to foment uncertainty to repatriate supply chains, and I think that spells a rocky road ahead for Americans.
Yeah, Bill, I wonder what you think about this. I mean, Trump came into office he still talks about himself as this consummate deal maker, but is that what America needs right now? Do we need more trade deals? Should we be focusing our attention in other areas?
Well, trade is not the only issue we face, but I do think we need more trade deals, which doesn't mean reinventing the world or the wheel. This president has, I think, an unconsidered but very deep aversion to multilateralism. Central problem with the TPP, as far as he's concerned, is not any of the substantive provisions. It's the fact that there are 12 people in it, and it's not just a deal between him and one other country or one other person. That's the way he thinks about trade and everything else. Mano a mano, two guys at one table. Okay? And we cannot hope to succeed as long as that ridiculous framework for trade negotiations persists. President Obama said rightly, in defense of the TPP, that there are going to be new rules for the global economy, and the question is who is going to write them. And the TPP was, I think, a reasonable effort to put the United States in the lead of writing the rules of the game for the 21st century. And if President Trump has a better idea than that, I haven't heard it.
Question before we go to the closing statements. Right, you know, as Bill and others have noted here, Trump has repeatedly expressed his preference for bilateral trade deals over multilateral ones. Christine, is there any sort of research that indicates that bilateral trade agreements are superior to multilateral trade agreements?
Well, it depends on your starting point. I mean, we did a lot of bilaterals, you know, in the Bush administration, but you know, there were some low-hanging fruit there. It was pretty easy to grab. These days, the barriers are just that we want to address are not necessarily tariffs. They're much bigger than the tariffs. They're, you know, investment restrictions, financial services, telecom, how to deal with state-owned enterprises, recourse mechanisms, dispute settlement. These are issues that you don't want to do bilaterally, or they're too difficult. You want to get a massive number, you know, a critical mass there, and start forming the rules that way, and then they're just, the world's different today. It's not a bilateral FTA world anymore. So I would say that.
Well said. Okay, well, thank you all for our tour of globalization and the American workforce. Before we finally end, I'm going to ask each of the debaters to give us, you know, their closing thoughts. And once again, please limit yourself to 90 seconds, and we'll start with Dan and then just proceed down.
I may limit myself to even less than 90 seconds because I was unaware that I was going to be making the statement. But I would say that if you believe that trade is a zero-sum game, if you subscribe to Trump's perspectives, you might actually say he's doing a good job, that he is throwing U.S. weight around, and he actually may secure some acquiescence to his demands. He's done that with Korea already, actually, by threatening to hit them with steel and aluminum tariffs. They've agreed to reduce their exports of steel and to increase their imports of U.S. autos that don't have to meet their safety standards. But I don't think that this is going to be costless. This approach is just so anathema to the spirit of the system that other governments are going to do the same thing. We're completely underestimating the value of the trading system. The rules are important. We've had 550 or 660 disputes at the WTO. About half of them are go to adjudication. It's worked reasonably well. There really haven't been trade wars, and that's for a variety of reasons. But I think going after the rules of trade without any idea what's going to replace it, I mean, how are businesses going to be able to plan for anything? How are you going to know what relationships to cultivate in foreign markets, who to invest with, who to have invest here? So the uncertainty that he's fomenting, he thinks is going to benefit the U.S. economy, but I think it's not. I think investors are looking for certainty. He's creating uncertainty. I'm hoping this chapter is over soon.
Bill?
It's no accident that Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. In the same way, it's no accident that insurgent parties are upending the establishments all across Europe and, you know, challenging the European Union and other multilateral institutions. There are tens of millions of people in the United States and in every advanced democracy who feel, for reasons they can't quite explain, that they have gotten the short end of the stick. Part of it has to do with the issue we've been talking about this evening, trade. Part of it has to do with resentment over immigration policy. Part of it has to do with very rapid cultural change. Part of it has to do with emerging and expanding regional inequalities where the big cities are doing very well and lots of small towns and rural areas are stagnating or falling behind. We need to think about trade policy and all of the other problems that I've just listed as challenges to our ability to create a more inclusive society where the benefits of trade, the benefits of immigration, the benefits of openness are widely shared throughout the population. That sounds like public policy to me, because if we let nature take its course, we're just going to keep on sinking deeper and deeper into the morass of today, and I don't want to live in that kind of country.
Christine.
Well, I think I'm more optimistic. I think, we are letting nature take its course, and we're seeing, digital platforms, financial technologies, small, medium-sized firms are using eBay, PayPal, Facebook to reach foreign markets. It's amazing. We're seeing small and medium-sized businesses able to get trade finance, deal with customs better, deal with other problems that before was difficult for them. So I guess I'm more optimistic. But obviously diligence, and increasing awareness of these issues. Look, the trade rhetoric, the heated trade rhetoric plays well with Trump's base, probably will for a while. But we're working very hard at Mercatus to make sure that policymakers understand the costs of these tariffs on U.S. manufacturers and the costs on American consumers. And again, if there's anything you guys take away from tonight, two things, right? One, trade policy does not affect. Tariff is a tax, a punitive tax on American manufacturers and American consumers. And I think number three, let's get back to the rules-based system. Let's sit down with our like-minded allies and write down stronger rules. And let's let the president show leadership on that front so the U.S. can write the next century of trade policy.
And Mark, you get the final word.
Sure, absolutely, and thank you for this great discourse. So, I would just say trade, I absolutely agree with Dan, is an incredibly important value and good, but it is a more disruptive one than we had assumed. We have minimized the harms over 30 or 40 years, and that have come with those gains. And I think we can't do that. We need to learn from the past as we move into a next era that will be about global flows and services. We can't continue looking in the rearview mirror at the manufacturing experience as our guide now. This is a new period. Digital flows of services, and it's about being serious to prepare for that. I think we've heard the importance of multilateralism. I think we've heard about investing more aggressively in our industry base, and it's going to take a much more realistic effort to deal with the harms of those who are left behind, people and places. Adjustment programs, we need to get our game back on training, and then safety net supports to mitigate the coming disruptions. I think it's going to be a tempestuous next generation. So I hope that we will learn from, I think the mistakes of the last period and be ready for what's coming.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark, for those comments, and thanks to all the debaters for their participation tonight, and thanks for everybody in the audience and for the people who watched us online. We hope you enjoyed the debate. We welcome your feedback on Twitter on how tonight went using the hashtag #AmericaInTheWorld for this final debate of the season. On behalf of the teams at Brookings, the Charles Koch Institute, and POLITICO, it has been a pleasure to bring this series to cities across the country to engage in already vibrant conversations on these issues. In St. Louis, Las Vegas, Atlanta, Dallas, Seattle, and here in Detroit, we've found tremendous appetite for engagement in civil debate. We are glad our events could contribute to that dialogue. From Detroit, thank you and good night.